Right now, in your life, there is someone who gives too much. Someone who notices when your blink rate changes by 3 milliseconds. Someone who adjusts their posture the second they sense a shift in your mood. You call them gentle. You call them soft. In popular culture, we call them an empath. And if you are like 98% of the population, you make a deadly cognitive error. You mistake their softness for weakness. In human behavior, there is a dangerous psychological phenomenon that almost nobody talks about until it is too late. It is the absolute point of critical mass within a hyper-attuned personality. Most people believe that when you push a compassionate person too far, they simply break, cry, or walk away. They expect a victim. They are dead wrong. What actually happens when you systematically dismantle an empath's trust is a quiet, terrifying behavioral shift known as psychological inversion. The very mechanisms they used to care for you, their hyper-awareness, their ability to read your deepest insecurities, their sub-perceptual mapping of your subconscious fears, do not disappear when they break. They invert. The individual who once understood your pain to heal it now possesses a complete, unredacted blueprint of your psychological vulnerabilities. And when an empath finally breaks, they don't get angry. They go cold. They stop feeling for you and start observing you. If you leave this room today without understanding this dynamic, you remain completely blind to one of the most lethal emotional traps in human interaction. You might be actively pushing someone toward this threshold right now in your relationship, your workplace, or your family, unaware that you are handing a master profiler the exact blueprint required to dismantle your entire life. You will not see the retaliatory strike coming because it won't look like an attack. It will look like absolute, terrifying efficiency. By the time you finish listening to what I am about to reveal, you will never look at a kind person the same way again. You will learn the exact micro-expressions that signal an empath has reached absolute zero, the 3 behavioral phases of their inversion, and why the most dangerous person in any room is never the one screaming. It is the quiet reader in the corner who just decided you no longer exist. Stay with me, pay attention to the subtext, and look very closely at the people around you. Because what you are about to learn isn't just psychological theory, it is a survival guide for human interaction. Look closely at human eyes when they are listening to you. Most people focus on the words, but if you pay attention to the micro-gestures, the slight tilt of the head, the micro-dilation of the pupils, the subtle adjustments in pupil tracking, you realize something profound. An empath isn't just listening to your words, they are profiling your baseline. Empathic individuals operate with an elevated level of sensory intake. Their nervous system functions like an uncalibrated radar, picking up subconscious cues, vocal pitch variations, and micro-expressions that average observers completely miss. For years, they use this intelligence for accommodation. They buffer your stress. They absorb your toxicity. They repair your self-esteem at the expense of their own baseline reserves. Because society rewards this self-sacrifice, manipulators and narcissists view empaths as soft targets. They assume an empath's capacity for forgiveness is an infinite loop. That assumption is a catastrophic miscalculation. Empathy is not a moral virtue. It is a sensory apparatus. And like any complex apparatus, when exposed to continuous overload, it undergoes a radical transformation. When an empath is repeatedly exploited, degraded, or betrayed, their brain eventually triggers a primary survival mechanism: tactical dissociation. In behavioral science, tactical dissociation is the moment emotion drops to absolute zero while cognitive processing jumps to maximum speed. The warmth vanishes, but the radar stays on. When an empath breaks, 3 distinct phases occur. The weeping stops. The emotional pleading ceases. The empath enters an hyper-analytical state. They begin running a quiet, retrospective audit of every interaction you have ever had. Because they were paying attention when you thought they were just being nice, they possess an exhaustive database of your life. They know what makes you feel small. They know who you secretly envy. They know the exact childhood wounds you try to hide behind your bravado. In this phase, they are not angry. They are cataloging vulnerabilities. An ordinary person seeking revenge makes noise. They send angry text messages, start arguments, or try to damage your reputation publicly. That is low-level behavioral reaction. A broken empath does none of that. They execute a silent, surgical withdrawal. They strip away your access to their energy without giving you a target to fight against. If you speak to them, they will look at you with total, unblinking clarity. No hostility, no warmth, just raw observation. You will feel an unsettling shift in the room, a sudden drop in emotional pressure, because you have been demoted from a human being in their ecosystem to a subject under observation. This is where the brutality peaks. When an empath reaches absolute breakpoint, they activate what behavioral profilers call the ghost protocol. They do not merely leave your life, they erase your presence from their reality. To the human brain, being violently opposed is manageable because opposition still validates your existence. Total indifference, however, triggers profound psychological panic. When a broken empath looks through you as if you are made of glass, your brain registers a complete absence of feedback. You become an invisible ghost in a room you used to control. If pushed to actively defend themselves, a broken empath does not use fists or crude insults. They use truth. With terrifying calm, they will deliver a single, precisely timed sentence that hits the exact psychological fault line of your deepest insecurity. It isn't an insult, it is an unvarnished profile of your character, delivered with zero vocal inflection. It devastates because it is accurate. Do not mistake patience for compliance. Do not mistake silence for submission. The gentlest people in your environment are often carrying the heaviest sensory load. If you leverage their kindness, you are playing with fire next to an open gas line. Treat the empaths in your life with absolute respect, clarity, and reciprocity, not just because they deserve it, but because if you force them to turn off their heart, the brain that remains is the most dangerous opponent you will ever face. An empath's empathy isn't just emotional warmth. It is an ultra-precise, real-time intelligence-gathering apparatus. And when pushed past the breaking point, that data collection doesn't stop. It turns defensive and predatory. To understand why this shift is so catastrophic, you must first dismantle the cultural myth that empathy is a passive, soft emotion. In reality, true high-level empathy is a continuous, high-bandwidth sensory intake system operating at a subconscious level. An empath is constantly scanning their environment, reading micro-expressions that flash across a face in a fraction of a second, tracking subtle shifts in vocal cadence, noticing changes in breathing patterns, and mapping body language adjustments that most people miss entirely. They process the emotional climate of a room the way a military radar array processes airspace. Under normal circumstances, an empath uses this vast reservoir of live intelligence for pro-social purposes. They adapt their behavior to comfort others, smooth over interpersonal friction, anticipate needs before they are articulated, and create a safe environment for those around them. They absorb your hidden anxieties and adjust their own posture to make you feel secure. However, manipulators and predatory personalities routinely make a fatal cognitive error when interacting with this dynamic. They confuse this high-volume adaptation with weakness or submissiveness. They assume that because the empath is accommodating, the empath is blind, naive, or easily managed. What they fail to realize is that the empath's gentleness is a conscious choice, not an inability to see reality. The data collection is happening continuously, regardless of whether the empath chooses to act on it. Every time a manipulator uses a subtle guilt trip, drops a passive-aggressive comment, lies by omission, or feigns vulnerability to gain leverage, The empath's internal tracking system logs the anomaly. They record the exact insecurities the manipulator tries to hide, the specific triggers that cause their ego to flare, the secret shame they mask behind arrogance, and the precise social connections they rely on for validation. The empath stores this entire behavioral profile automatically. When that empath is subjected to repeated psychological abuse, betrayal, or systemic exploitation, their nervous system eventually hits an absolute threshold of overload. At this precise point of critical mass, the primary function of their observational apparatus fundamentally shifts. The emotional buffer shuts down to prevent further psychological injury, but the intelligence-gathering engine does not go offline. Instead, it weaponizes. The hyper-observation that was once used to heal, protect, and nurture is instantly rerouted into a cold, tactical profiling mechanism. The empath stops feeling with you and begins calculating around you. The real-time stream of behavioral data is no longer processed through a filter of compassion or forgiveness. It is filtered strictly through survival, defense, and strategic assessment. They see right through the performative confidence, the manipulative tactics, and the artificial social masks. Because they spent months or years observing you with intimate, hyper-attuned attention, their mental database contains a complete, unredacted map of your entire psychological vulnerability matrix. They know what makes you feel small, what makes you feel exposed, and exactly where your fragile self-image is supported by optical illusions. When an empath reaches this cold, inverted state, your attempts to manipulate or intimidate them become completely ineffective, because they are no longer reacting to your surface-level behavior. They are analyzing the underlying desperation driving it in real time, turning your own hidden flaws into the very instruments of your neutralization. The shattering of the moral mirror represents the exact psychological threshold where an empath's capacity for endurance permanently collapses. To comprehend the severity of this shift, one must analyze the subconscious framework an empath uses to navigate human relationships. Under standard operating conditions, an empath projects their own internal baseline onto the world around them. They possess a deep-seated, often unconscious belief that every human being operates with a core of redeemable humanity, a conscience capable of remorse, and an inherent desire for emotional healing. When someone hurts them, lies to them, or exploits their vulnerability, the empath does not immediately view that person as an adversary. Instead, they view them as a damaged system. They deploy what behavioral profilers call prospective redemption. They assume the aggressor's toxic behavior is merely a maladaptive defense mechanism stemming from unhealed trauma, unresolved pain, or temporary emotional distress. Because the empath projects their own high capacity for moral reflection onto the abuser, they look at the abuser's cruelty through a lens of potential restoration. They tell themselves that with enough patience, enough understanding, enough absorbed pain, and enough unconditional support, the aggressor will eventually experience an epiphany, recognize the harm they are causing, and choose to reform. This moral mirror is the very reason empaths tolerate extreme levels of relational degradation for far longer than the average person. They are not remaining in the situation out of cowardice. They are trapped by their own projection of human goodness. However, when an abuser crosses a specific, non-negotiable line of calculated malice or prolonged betrayal, this projected framework experiences a sudden, violent structural failure. The empath undergoes a rapid cognitive realignment known as moral mirror disillusionment. In a single moment of absolute clarity, the illusion shatters completely. The empath suddenly realizes that the aggressor does not operate under the same moral continuum, does not possess a hidden reservoir of empathy, and has zero interest in redemption or genuine human connection. The individual was not reacting out of temporary pain. They were actively exploiting the empath's compassion as a tactical vulnerability. The moment this realization locks into place, the empath's internal categorization of that person changes irreversibly. The humanization of the abuser vanishes. When the moral mirror breaks, the empath stops projecting their own soul onto the aggressor. They no longer see a wounded human being who needs to be saved, understood, or shielded from the consequences of their own actions. Instead, they see a pure behavioral hazard, an ecosystem of calculated vulnerabilities that must be permanently neutralized to restore safety. The instinct to repair is instantly replaced by an instinct to sever. The empathy that once served as a bridge for connection is converted into a cold, objective diagnostic tool. Every past transgression, every manipulative phrase, and every fake apology is instantly re-indexed without emotional distortion. The empath no longer feels guilt for setting boundaries, nor do they feel an obligation to offer second chances, because you cannot negotiate or reconcile with an entity you now recognize as fundamentally parasitic. The aggressor is completely stripped of their emotional immunity, transformed from a person worthy of love into a subject under absolute cold analysis. Surgical system disassembly is the operational execution phase that occurs immediately after an empath's emotional buffer goes cold and their moral mirror shatters. Unlike impulsive, emotionally reactive individuals who lash out with loud insults, explosive arguments, or immediate, messy confrontations, a broken empath operates with a terrifying level of clinical precision. Emotional reactors give away their hand because their primary objective is immediate emotional release. They want you to see their pain, feel their anger, or respond to their chaos. A broken empath has no desire to display emotion because they no longer view you as a worthy recipient of their internal state. Their objective shifts entirely from communication to systematic dismantling. To execute this, the empath draws directly upon the vast, unredacted database of behavioral intelligence they quietly gathered during the time they spent caring for you. Because they spent months or years observing your subperceptual cues, they possess an exact blueprint of your social, emotional, and psychological dependencies. They know precisely which relationships sustain your fragile self-esteem, which authority figures you desperately try to impress, which specific narratives you use to maintain your public image, and which secret insecurities keep you awake at night. In this phase, the empath does not launch a direct, overt attack that would allow you to play the victim or rally support against them. Instead, they execute a quiet, multi-layered neutralization protocol designed to isolate you from the very structures that validate your ego. They begin by systematically withdrawing the unseen labor that kept your life balanced. If they previously managed your emotional outbursts, buffered your social reputation, or quietly smoothed over the collateral damage caused by your arrogance, they instantly stop. They step back and allow every structural flaw in your life to run its natural, catastrophic course. Simultaneously, they begin severing your access to their network with surgical efficiency. If you share mutual social or professional circles, the empath does not engage in obvious smear campaigns, which would look desperate and unstable. Instead, they deploy absolute, unvarnished truth delivered with flat, emotionless clarity. When asked about the dynamic, they do not offer passionate accusations. They state objective, documented facts about your behavior, stripped of all dramatic fluff. Because the empath has built up a long-standing reputation as a rational, kind, and observant individual, their calm, clinical delivery carries an overwhelming weight of credibility. People believe them instantly. One by one, the pillars supporting your social safety net begin to wobble, not because the empath fabricated a lie, but because the empath simply removed the protective shield of secrecy they had previously granted you. On a direct interpersonal level, the disassembly is even more targeted. The empath neutralizes every manipulative tactic you attempt to use. If you try to bait them with rage, they offer a blank, analytical stare. If you attempt to play the victim, they dissect your argument in real time with surgical logic, pointing out the exact contradictions in your narrative without raising their voice. You find yourself fighting an opponent who refuses to absorb your tension, returning your psychological strikes with an absolute impenetrable void that leaves you completely overextended, exposed, and deprived of the control you once took for granted. The absolute zero door slam represents the final, irreversible phase of an empath's psychological detachment, culminating in the complete and permanent retraction of human access. Unlike standard relational breakups, where residual emotional attachment, anger, or nostalgia leaves a doorway cracked open for future contact, the absolute zero door slam functions as a total behavioral blackout. To fully comprehend the impact of this maneuver, one must look closely at what an abuser or manipulator actually relies on during an interpersonal conflict. A predatory personality feeds on engagement. Whether that engagement manifests as tears, desperate arguments, attempts at reconciliation, or fiery retaliation, it all serves the same function. It provides validation, emotional feedback, and a clear signal that the target is still anchored within their sphere of influence. Emotional intensity, even when negative, is a form of control. When an empath executes the absolute zero door slam, they strip away this fuel source instantly and entirely. They do not send a final dramatic essay over text. They do not engage in a tearful confrontation. They do not post passive-aggressive messages on social media to gauge your reaction. Instead, they drop the emotional temperature of the interaction to absolute zero and quietly step out of your reality. Every communication channel is permanently sealed, not out of petty spite, but out of a clinical determination that you no longer exist as a relevant variable in their life. For the individual on the receiving end, this abrupt transition creates a profound sense of psychological vertigo. Because they spent months or years using the empath as an emotional anchor, a sounding board, and a source of constant validation, the sudden, absolute retraction of that presence leaves an immense vacuum. The abuser attempts to deploy their standard hoovering tactics, sending casual check-in messages, manufacturing artificial emergencies, or attempting to bait a reaction through mutual acquaintances, only to hit an impenetrable wall of utter silence. If forced to interact with you in a shared physical or professional environment, the broken empath treats you with the same flat, neutral detachment they would extend to a piece of office furniture. They look through you, respond with precise monosyllabic utility if strictly necessary, and offer zero micro-expressions of warmth, anger, or familiarity. You are stripped of your ability to elicit a reaction, which severely destabilizes your internal sense of control. This complete retraction of feedback triggers a powerful sensory deprivation effect within the abuser's psyche. They are forced to sit alone with the unfiltered weight of their own actions, deprived of the empath's protective buffer, and unable to project their internal chaos onto a responsive target. The ghosting executed by an average person is often born out of conflict avoidance or temporary overwhelm, leaving room for future renegotiation. The absolute zero door slam, by contrast, is a definitive, highly conscious act of psychological erasure. The empath has systematically processed every memory, extracted every necessary lesson, closed the file on the relationship, and rendered your presence completely irrelevant to their future existence. The neutralization protocol serves as the ultimate analytical framework for understanding the precise behavioral mechanics that occur when a hyper-attuned system transitions from passive endurance to active self-preservation. To analyze this threshold effectively, one must move past the simplistic narrative of emotional victimhood and examine the raw structural dynamics of relational pressure. In any interpersonal system involving an empath, there exists an invisible, highly volatile equilibrium. On one side of the scale is the empath's high-capacity sensory intake and emotional tolerance. On the other side is the secondary party's emotional demands, manipulative behaviors, or boundary transgressions. Because an empath possesses an unusually elastic tolerance for interpersonal discomfort, the secondary party often operates under the false assumption that the system can withstand infinite structural stress. They continue to increase psychological leverage, push boundaries, and extract emotional resources without realizing they are driving the system toward a definitive point of critical mass. The neutralization protocol is the automatic, non-negotiable shift that activates the moment that critical mass is breached. Recognizing the early behavioral signals of this shift is essential for anyone seeking to understand high-risk relational mechanics, as the transition from tolerance to neutralization occurs long before the overt rupture takes place. The first observable sign within the protocol is the systematic shutdown of emotional microsignatures. In a healthy state, an empath continuously provides nonverbal feedback during conversation. Micro-nodding, subtle changes in eye contact, vocal softening, and postural leaning that signal active empathetic resonance. As the neutralization protocol engages, these microsignatures vanish completely. The empath's vocal tone flattens to a consistent, unmodulated frequency. Their posture shifts into a neutral, low-exposure alignment, and their eye contact becomes steady, unblinking, and entirely unreadable. They are no longer absorbing your psychological state. They are actively observing your operational mechanics. The second phase of the protocol involves the total cessation of energetic intervention. An empath in a pre-threshold state spends significant internal energy managing the emotional baseline of the room, buffering conflicts, explaining their feelings, and trying to repair broken lines of communication. When the protocol activates, this intervention drops to zero. They stop explaining themselves, stop correcting your misinterpretations, and stop attempting to resolve underlying tension. If you present a false narrative or an emotional accusation, they no longer fight to set the record straight. They simply allow the falsehood to sit in the air, using your own reliance on drama to exhaust your leverage. They recognize that defending themselves provides you with energetic engagement, so they deny you the target entirely. The final stage of the neutralization protocol is the execution of absolute behavioral containment. The empath quietly maps out their exit strategy with clinical efficiency, removing all financial, social, and emotional overlap without making a single threat or announcement. By understanding these precise behavioral mechanics, researchers, profilers, and individuals alike can recognize that an empath's eventual retaliation or total withdrawal is never an impulsive, erratic outburst. It is the calculated, predictable result of pushing a hyper-attuned intelligence system past its structural limits, turning a once unconditional source of support into a cold, impenetrable wall of absolute neutralization.